waiting on me. Let's go to that next slide then. The next slide, which is the first slide, I guess. Last week, and this is just kind of a continuation of, we went through the first 4 chapters of Esther, and so we just want to kind of continue in the book of Esther here this week. And we kind of talked about it, and we started off with this quote last week from motivational speaker Jim Rohn, and it says, "You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." And we kind of, as we went along in the book of Esther, we were reading and hearing that Esther was getting her advice from Mordecai, and she was succeeding. Meanwhile, there was other people, and every time they were getting advice from somebody, it wasn't going well. And I think that that's such a lesson of that some of us have learned, and some of us have learned the good parts and the bad parts of that. We listen to certain people and we find ourselves in horrible situations, and other times we find ourselves listening to people, and it doesn't guarantee that everything's going to go perfectly, but it seems that even the rough patches seem to go a lot smoother. So, as we ended last week, we ended it in chapter 4, and what has happened is they have found out that there is a plan in place to that everybody's going to have the opportunity to kill all the Jews. Haman is mad at the Jews because he doesn't like this man Mordecai, and Mordecai is the man that Esther's been taking her advice from, and he doesn't like it because he doesn't show him the attention that he thinks he deserves. And so he put something in place and went to the king and got it to where all the Jews are going to be attacked on a certain day in the future. And when Mordecai hears this, he goes to Esther. And here, just to recap last week, in chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, it says, "Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows, perhaps, if you were made queen for just such a time as this." Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. "Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same, and then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die." So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So I think there's a couple interesting things here as we kind of just recap a little bit. But what he says here is, in verse 14, it says, "Deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place." And I think that is his faith in God right there, where he's saying that, this horrible thing is kind of set in place, but he's still going to have faith in God that God is going to come through in some way. And so he's just trying to show Esther his faith and say, I put my faith in God, and I know that somehow we're going to get through this. But don't think that because you're in this palace and everything is wonderful, that you're not going to suffer a loss of some kind. And I think that's so important that, again, he's listening to the advice that says, guess what? You may suffer loss. You may have something bad happen. And then I also think it's interesting that towards the end of this, it says, "So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him." And so again, when you have wise counsel, you're able to kind of feed off each other and help each other out. And, she's been listening to Mordecai for all these years, and now all of a sudden she's in a position, and she's going to make a decision, and Mordecai is listening to her. And so she says to Mordecai, "Do not eat or drink for 3 days, and then my maids and I will do the same thing." And so I just kind of went looking for a quick definition of fasting in this situation, because I think it's so important to kind of see how they use fasting. And here it says, "The practice of refraining from eating or drastically reducing your food intake for a certain amount of time can focus your thoughts and sharpen our responses to certain situations. When we break from our regular routines of eating at certain times of the day, we allow our bodies to assist our minds in understanding that for a time we are going to be denying ourselves one thing in the interest of pursuing or considering another, typically higher question or goal." And then the follow-up later on in the article I was reading said this. It said, "Fasting is good for multiple reasons. To seek God out, to know his ways, to pursue answers to decisions that are coming into play in one's life, and to intentionally draw closer to him." And I really like looking at those two kind of ways of describing fasting, because I'm thinking to myself, this had to be what Esther did. because she didn't know what was going to happen. She was putting herself in a position where, she could go to the king and the king would be like, hey, I didn't call on you. We know that he has very little patience for queens that don't listen to him. So she's going to put herself in this situation. But before she puts herself in this situation, she's going to pause for 3 days and then kind of, seek out God to know his ways and pursue answers to decisions that are coming into play in one's life. So we kind of see how she went at this. And I think it's another great example for us to look at. And so now if we go to chapter 5, Esther's request to the king. And so it says here, on the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes, entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." And Esther replies, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." So we kind of start to see here, she didn't rush into anything, and she has a plan that she got, I'm guessing, from God, because of how, I just think how much of a unique situation it is and how she handles it. So if we continue, the king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And so I just want to stop here for a second, just so we're all on the same page. Haman is the one who has created this situation where all the Jews are going to be put in a situation where they could be killed. And her response is, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite him to a banquet where it's just the king and myself and Haman. And again, that's not something that somebody would think about. I think that, when we rush to something where, she's going to say, hey, let me just get the king, and then I'm going to talk to the king. And we wouldn't have necessarily thought of that. And so if we continue in verse 6, it says, "And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, 'Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? What is your request? I will give it to you even if it's half the kingdom.'" So again, he's smart and he's like, okay, I know you want something. What is it that you want? And so Esther replies, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king and it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." So when this book started, it was starting with 180 days of celebration. So she knows he likes celebration. One day is just not good enough. So she sits there and she says, "Hey, I just want to come and I just want to serve you and do something to show my appreciation for you on this first day. I'm not going to ask you for anything. I'm just going to show my appreciation. And then what I want you to do is I want you to come back tomorrow." And so if we continue here, it says Haman's plan to kill Mordecai. And again, so now we're going to see Haman and his people and how they react to certain situations. And it says, "Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home." And right here it says, he's going to get, we're going to see who influences Haman. And it says, "Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him, and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, 'And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow.'" And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, we've all found ourselves on the wrong end of this. We found ourselves in a situation where we brag and brag and brag, and God has a whole different plan for us. And I think sometimes when, we make that decision to get all of our friends together to tell them how great we are, I've always said that God always has a plan to humble me when I need humbled. And so it's interesting to kind of look at it from the perspective that we're looking at now, where we know that she has a different plan in place, and here he is bragging to all of his friends. Then he added, but this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate." So Haman's wife Zeresh and all of his friends suggested, Set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleases Haman, and he ordered the pole to be set up. So, first of all, I'm amazed at how quickly they moved there. He wanted a 75-foot pole put up, and magically it's there right away. So that is pretty impressive to me. But again, here he is going to his wife, and, I think as a wife, as a husband, we expect our wives to give us these great suggestions on how we need to handle certain situations. And here she says, you know what you should do? Set up a sharpened pole. And it's not just like I think to myself a 5 or 10 foot pole would have done. But instead she says, put a 75-foot pole out there and ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. He's had influence over the king before, so this probably doesn't seem like that big of a deal. So now chapter 6, it says, the king honors Mordecai. And so again, God always has a different plan in place, and sometimes we don't even realize it. And so here it says here that night, so what has just happened is he set up a 75-foot pole. That's what happened earlier in the night. And then all of a sudden now we're looking at the king, and the king, he can't sleep that night. It says, that night the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. So, again, I think God takes somebody's imperfections and uses it. Here we have a man who cannot sleep, and he thinks to himself, you know what would help me sleep? I want somebody to come bring a book that's all about all the great accomplishments I've done, and if they read it to me, that would really help me sleep. So, you guys can try that next time you're having a hard time sleeping. So, as he's reading that, it says, in those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition? The king had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. And so then the king says, what reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who is that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So right here, I think it's a perfect time to just kind of pause for a second and again realize that sometimes, I think we never realize how close we are to somebody wanting something bad to happen. And also how close we are to God knowing what's going to happen and Him having His own plan in place. And I think sometimes when we get so arrogant in our ways and we think about how important we are, we don't realize that, here we are, we're going to the king and we're going to ask him to impale somebody, and he just has a whole other plan in place. And the plan that he had in place was to make sure that the king didn't sleep, to make sure that the king wanted to hear a story about himself, and where the hero is the same exact person that somebody else wants to kill. And it says, so the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. And so here we are. We have another perfect example of how Haman is. It says here, so Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? And I think that is so amazing to sit there and, here's somebody who's so important, and what he is doing, he is sitting there and he's thinking, oh, this important person, the only person in the whole entire kingdom that he would probably be talking about is me. And so he answers the question as if this is going to be something done for him. So his answer is, let's see. So Haman came in and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? And so here's his response in verse 7. It says, so he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. So again, he has influence over the king. The king hears this and says, you know what? That's an excellent idea, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. And I just think as I read this, how can you not laugh at this? How can you not sit there and think this is what happens when you're so arrogant and so blind to how you treat other people? You sit there and you just think that you're so much above them and that every good thing is probably about you. And so, again, I think we kind of get a little bit of the mindset of to what Haman wished would happen to him. He wishes that the king would say, here, ride on my horse, and I'm going to take an official and just parade you around. That's probably what he wanted. And so what happens is when we're blind to how we treat other people and we're getting bad advice from everybody, we end up being the one who's holding on to the horse. And so Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. So I think here, we can kind of see that the tide is starting to turn, and Haman is really kind of starting to see, but in the back of his mind, he's like, but I have a bigger plan, and I'm going to go home, and I'm going to talk to those same people who in the past has given me such great advice that has worked out so wonderfully. So he thinks to himself, I feel dejected and humiliated, so what I want to do is I want to go home, and I want to go talk to these people who always tell me how great I am. And so it says, when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all of his friends, so I don't know why his friends are always there, but it seems like as we kind of read this, he comes home and his friends have been hanging out with his wife all day, and then they continue to give him such horrible advice. So it says, and all of his friends, what had happened, his wise advisors, so I don't know if his friends and his wise advisors are the same people or if there's even more people here, and I do think it's at least a little bit amusing that he calls them wise advisors. Since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. So he's kind of going through all these things, and he's listening to these friends and wise advisors and trying to figure out what he should do, and they're kind of telling him, hey, you know what, you're not going to win this situation right now, we'll figure out something. And before they figure out anything else, all of a sudden these people show up and they say, hey, I hope you're ready, it's time for your banquet. And so here we're going to continue in chapter 7, and it kind of tells us right away how this story is going to end. It says the king executes Haman. And so the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet on the second occasion. While they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom." And so here we are. We're finally in the situation where she's going to say what she wants. And I think it's so interesting here that the king always seems to be saying, I'll give you up to half the kingdom. And so he's kind of looked at her and he says, what do you want? I'll give you anything you want up to half the kingdom. And here in verse 3 is Queen Esther's reply. She says, if I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. And I think to myself, as she's sitting here talking, what is Haman thinking? Has it occurred to him that in all of his time of being angry at Mordecai, that he never looked over and noticed that maybe that she wasn't where like him? And so maybe she was from a different place or had a different background. And it never occurred to him. And I just wonder if she's starting to tell this story, is he slowly realizing that he made a decision that affected her and that he was now in trouble because she's talking to the king about it? And so now all of a sudden she said her little bit to the king, and the king responds, "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out to the palace garden. And so now all of a sudden everybody has kind of realized what's going on here. The king realizes that Haman gave him some bad advice and put him in a situation where his queen is now all of a sudden in a situation where she might be killed by someone. And it was him that kind of made that final decision. So he's mad. And so right away what he does is he gets up, he's mad and he's frustrated, and he goes out to the garden. And all of a sudden Haman realizes what's going on, and he realized that his last hope is to look at Queen Esther and beg for his life. And so it says here, Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. So now we have a bad situation that's really worse. And it says here, the king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. And so I see a situation where, I don't know why I see this, but I just see like in the movies where somebody comes in and they put a bag over your head. That's the way I see it in my mind. Is he's sitting here and he's pleading and he's fumbling all around and he's falling in front of Esther and he doesn't know what's going on. Then the king comes in and he starts yelling, and they make it sound like he went out to the garden to just kind of, hey, I need to think for a minute and get my thoughts right. But now what he probably did is he probably said, okay, we're going to go back in and I need you to take care of this guy for me. And so the attendants covered his face, signaling his doom. And then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. And I just think to myself, isn't it just crazy how things work out? Isn't it crazy how, here's Mordecai who day in and day out just tried to do the right thing. He tried to do what God wanted him to do. He fasted when he needed to fast. He raised Esther even though it wasn't his child. He gave her the advice that he gave her. And I think one of the things that we find out is sometimes when we live the right life and we do what we're supposed to do, sometimes people are going to not like us for it. So all of a sudden, he got this bad advice, and he had this pole set up, and all of a sudden, when they figure out that he's going to die, the eunuchs come in and they say, "Hey, he had this 75-foot pole set up to kill this guy. That guy who was going to save you, that saved you." And so, of course, it ends up that Haman is killed on that same pole. And now, chapter 8, as we're getting kind of close to the end of the book here, we have a situation where the good news is that Haman is now dead, but the decree has already been sent out that on this certain day you have the right to attack all the Jews and kill them if you want. And so it says here in chapter 8, verse 1, "On that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property." So we're kind of starting to see here how the story is going to end and how it's going to end well for Mordecai. And it says, "Then Esther went again before the king, falling down at his feet and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman, the Agagite, against the Jews. Again, the king held out the gold scepter to Esther, so she rose and stood before him. Esther said, 'If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if he thinks it is right, and if I am pleasing to him, let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, who ordered that Jews throughout all the king's provinces should be destroyed. For how can I endure to see my people and my family slaughtered and destroyed?'" And as we're sitting there looking at this, she's just so, she's sitting there trying to say all these things. If I'm pleasing to him, if I have found favor with him, if he thinks it's right, and she says, could you just reverse this? And if we continue on, then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, I have given Esther the property of Haman, and he has been impaled on a pole because he tried to destroy the Jews. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. But now, after he says all those things, and it sounds like everything's going smoothly, he says this one last line. But remember that whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring can never be revoked. And what he is saying there is, I used my signet ring, or I let Haman use my signet ring earlier on. And he put this decree in place. And because my signet ring is there, I can't take it back. And so I can't do anything to reverse it because the signet ring is there. And so it says, the king's decree gave the Jews in every city the authority to unite to defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and to take the property of their enemies. The day chosen for this event through all the provinces of King Xerxes was March 7th of that next year, which is exactly the date that was there that they could kill them. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all people, so that the Jews would be ready to take revenge on their enemies on the appointed day. So urged on by the king's command, this message rode out swiftly on fast horses bred for the king's service. The same decree was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing the royal robe of blue and white, and the great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated the new decree. The Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. In every province and city where the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves, for they feared what the Jews might do to them. So as we kind of look at everything in the chapter 9 and 10 is very short, but chapter 9 is all about what happened on these days. And what we find out is that absolutely 0 Jews died on that day. God took care of them. With Mordecai's advice, they all knew what to do. And so we see a situation where when people took the advice of people who were wise, they ended up succeeding. But we also saw situations where even though you did the right thing, and even though you thought, you were taking great advice, it doesn't mean that everything was going to be perfect. And I think that that's such good advice as we kind of go throughout our week or we go throughout everything that we have going on. We need to realize that things aren't going to be perfect, but we do need to listen to wise people. And I think it's wonderful that this last final song that we're going to sing, or I guess the second to last song, is I have decided to follow Jesus. And I think it's so important to realize that we're going to have to make a whole lot of decisions in life. And, I don't recommend just putting, every single person in your life in your close circle. They don't all need to be Christians. I think the goal is to make them a Christian at some point by leading the life that you need to live. But we have to have some Christian influence on every decision that we make. And so I think as we sing, I have decided to follow Jesus here, we really need to think about how we want him to influence everything we do on a daily basis. We want to have him be part of the decision-making process on all the decisions that we make. Because if we look back at the book of Esther, we really see how he was working behind the scenes. And sometimes we get so focused on what we can see in front of us that we forget that God is working behind the scenes. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, please help us to decide to follow you. Please help us to understand that no matter what we have going on, no matter what we think we're seeing, you're working behind the scenes. Please put people in our lives that will help give us godly advice. Please put people in our lives who love you and listen to you. Please help us to always turn to you for advice. Please help us to trust you. In Jesus' name, amen.